Steve is the editor of movies like What Women Want, Something's Gotta Give, Ishtar, The World According to Garp, and The Right Stuff. And I thought it was interesting to talk about or bring up some of the films that he kind of started on. Steve Roder.
Before we start, my co-editor on this film was William Scharf, who lost his house in the LA fire. So I think that it's somewhat fitting that I'm here and that part of the proceeds are being donated to that cause. So thank you very much.
I've talked to Billy about it, and he's getting along, but it's pretty tough out there. Anyway, so Steve came up in kind of the New York film elite, I would say, like the films like Dog Day Afternoon and Night Moves, Little Big Man, Alice's Restaurant, and Slaughterhouse-Five.
Right, and I was fortunate to be mentored by Dee Dee Allen, who has a long line of accomplished editors that followed in her footsteps. So I owe a lot to her, as well as to Elaine May and Arthur Penn, who taught me a lot of things, which probably you see some of them in this particular film. But the reason that I picked this film is that it's charmed. From the very beginning, the project was sensational. The acting was unbelievable. The cast and crew was phenomenal. Steve Martin I did 3 films with Steve, and not that he knows who I am, because he probably doesn't. But in any case, this film, his facial expressions, everything he does is unbelievably concise and perfect. And Michael Caine the same way. And one of the reasons for the success of this film is that I think you see, or you feel, that the two of them truly enjoyed doing it. And they enjoyed each other. I'm not sure whether that's true, but I always felt it looked like it. And if you see the facial expressions, I mean, it wasn't like you had to work to find pieces to go into, to make sure that people understood it. It was always there. And I don't know how many of you know the business, but one of the downfalls of film editing is that you have to preview in front of audiences. And usually, before the preview, you either want to cut your own throat or you can't sleep for days. And I always felt like a combination of both. This film went to preview, did great right away. The only problem that we had was we previewed once in Berkeley, which is the handicap capital of the world, and we were slightly worried that we were going to get a hostile audience, but we did. So,
you once told me a story about George Roy Hill in previews.
Yeah, so I worked as an assistant on Slaughterhouse-Five, and then I did World According to Garp with George Roy Hill. And he once told me that the studio previewed Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, and they wanted to take out the song Raindrops. They felt it had nothing to do with the film, which actually it didn't. However, George felt that it was a big plus for the commercial aspect of the film. So during the preview, he had 12 different pens with different colors, and he wrote hundreds of cards in the lobby. And when the audience filed out and they read the cards, they said, "Gee, Mr. Hill, you were right. It was their favorite scene." There were 125 cards that mentioned it as their favorite. So, and he once said to me, he was an award-winning, Academy Award-winning director and accomplished in every level. He once said to me, "I'm always afraid they're going to catch me out," meaning that he didn't really think that people were going to believe that he was as talented as he was. And I always felt the same way. Every time I entered a project, I thought, can I do this? Is this, maybe I can't. Maybe there's too much pressure. Maybe, it costs more to make some of these films than it does to build a huge building. So, it was scary. I once had a good friend say to me, he was previewing a film that started out as a musical, then they took the music out because it did so poorly, And he said, you know, we were previewing it, and I leaned over to my sound editor and I said, I feel like I'm attending my own funeral. And 2 years later, they released the film. So in some ways, he was.
It's funny what you said about architecture, though, because Arthur Penn once said to me something to that effect. And in the end, you just have your name on a box, and
Yeah, it's
in
true.
the end, they have a building. You know.
So, but this movie was, I mean, every time I see it, it's the only movie that I've ever worked on that I watched over and over again and still laughed at things. I mean, the whipping scene gets me in hysterics. I mean, and the expressions on his face, and the Rupert scene. You know, my daughter was 12 when we did that movie. She's now 50. And she's here tonight.
Don't give that away.
So-
You were talking about the cork and the fork scene. Is that
Well,
also?
The funnier than the cork and the fork, I thought, was the scene in the basement.
Uh-huh.
So the scene in the basement, Frank, we had a few women on the crew, and if you notice at the end of that scene, Steve Martin sort of starts to climb on top of the woman. Well, that went on for quite a while, and it looked like he was humping her. And Frank wanted to take out the Vaseline in the glove, because I think that, you know, to men, that's like, oh my God. But to women, you know, being climbed on top of is worse. So we took a vote, and all the women on the crew said, you have to take that out. That's, you know, disgusting.
What was interesting is that it's all shot. It's like a POV without
Right.
her, so
Yeah, yeah.
that's why.
So,
Yeah.
Anyway, so that's the only real change that I sort of talked him into. Other than that, and now Frank Oz, who is a genius comic director, doesn't have a funny bone in his body. So explain that.
Well, I mean, talk about Michael Caine's personality. Because you were on location, you actually, Steve might not know who you are, but you were around
Yeah,
those guys
well,
all the time. So talk about their personalities and how
well,
they may have differed from.
So my daughter came to the set, and she had a friend with her, and we also took our dog to Nice. And so they would come to the set maybe twice during the whole thing, and whoever held the dog, Steve Martin would go over and pet the dog. So they would fight about who held the dog next. And Michael Caine would say to me, how am I doing? Almost every time he saw me. And I'd say, well, you should wait and ask me how I'm doing after you see the movie. But he was a delight. And, you know, there's a joke about when the phone rings and he picks it up, he goes, I'll do it. So he probably has done more movies than any contemporary actor around.
I think he and Sam Jackson have the record.
Well, yeah. Also, De Niro.
That's true. But so, you know, you talk about George and his comedy. This film has sort of sophisticated comedy, but it also has slapstick comedy. And tonight I really noticed how the sound helped
Well-
some of those scenes, like, for instance, the palm bush scene.
Right, and the whipping scene. So the sound editor on this film was a true genius. His name was Alan Splett, and he did a number of, I worked on, or he worked with me on 4 films, but he was, originally he did Eraserhead, and that's where he became known, and won, I'm not sure, yeah, he did win an Academy Award, and then they had a tribute for him, and he couldn't see, so he had glasses like Coke bottles, and the monitor was this close to his face when he was working on it, and yet he came up with the most brilliant sounds ever. I worked on Never Cry Wolf, which probably no one here has ever even heard of. But there was a saxophone.
Oh, you're the ones.
Right. There was a saxophone in the scene lying in the snow or the ground or whatever, and each time a drop of water would hit, it was a different musical note. I mean, it was unbelievable. And he was also a cellist, so he was very proud of the fact something just happened. But I hate the sound of my own voice. But anyway, he was very proud of the fact that he had just bought a new bow for his cello that was extremely expensive. Unfortunately, he got cancer and died in his 50s. So we lost someone who was really unbelievable talent. And also Michael Bauhaus was an incredible cinematographer, and his son, Florian, is now a cinematographer and was the operator on this movie. And one of the best stories is the film is just perfectly cast, but everyone was afraid of Barbara Harris. Steve Martin was like spooked by her. Frank Oz would not. I said to Frank, you have to go and loop Barbara because, you know, we need a better sounding line than this. You can't really understand it. He said, I'm not doing it. I never want to see her again. And I said, well, you have to because, no, he said, you go, tell her I'm sick. And that's what happened. And she was kind of weird. So, during that scene, for some reason, Steve somehow picked up a newspaper and whacked something with it. And she said, do that again. And he went whack, and she said her line. Just keep doing it, whack, said her line, whack, whack, whack. So he was totally weirded out. And Frank too, so. But she's terrific in the movie.
I mean, you're somewhat known, you and I have talked about this, as being able to kind of splice words and make words kind of fit into certain situations. And can you break down that scene in the airplane and how ADR changed some of that scene? Because
I don't really remember. All I know was it wasn't so much ADR changing the scene, it was making it as short as you could. So there's a lot of dialogue cut.
Mm-hmm.
I've had occasion where, you know, a director is convinced that the sound is terrible, a scene is terrible, and they have to go shoot another scene the next day, and they're all upset, and you just have to say to them, well, you know, well, let me put it together. Go do, you know, they can't really think about what they've done. They have to think about what's coming the next day. So I'll put it together and see if you need anything else. So in that case, we didn't. There was just an unintelligible line. But to me, the key to this movie are the expressions on Steve's face, which are just priceless, as well as Michael Caine's deadpan. And of course, Glenn Headley, who really is a comic genius, unfortunately died not so long ago, as well as Barbara Harris, I think, is not around anymore. And Michael Caine's 95 and is retired. So, and I'm getting up there, unfortunately.
Was it difficult to keep the secret going with Glenn? I mean, I was watching her very closely today. She doesn't give anything away.
Nothing. Well, one of the interesting things about the movie is that there was a writer's strike on that started about midway through the movie. And so they didn't have an ending yet. I think they may have had a slight concept, but they had no ending. And the writer couldn't work on the ending of the film because of the strike. So Steve and Frank got together, and I think they actually wrote the scene. I'm not sure whether they invented it or whether that I don't have the information for that, but it's a surprise. And Glenn is fabulous in that scene, and Louis Zorich, who is this all-character actor, is fantastic. So you couldn't ask for better raw material than this. And I don't remember ever really having any difficulties. Somehow it just jumped together.
I want to talk about two more things, and then
Sure.
maybe we'll ask some questions from the audience. But one is I love the getting on the Ritz montage.
Right.
So talk about how you came up with that, who came up with that, and what kind of temp score you used to get to Miles Goodman's.
Well, Stefan Grappelli, I think, was a French jazz violinist, and we used some of his. And I think that Miles may have done some sketches, but it was always treated to be jump cut. I think, I'm not sure whether Frank clued us in before. I think Frank did clue us in that he wanted, you know, to jump cut one to another. And of course, as an editor, you always think to yourself, whoa, how am I going to do that? But it worked very well.
Well, especially then, and like even Steve Martin, we're used to Steve Martin doing all that stuff now, but then it was
Right.
really
And you know, I think that in all of Steve Martin's work, I think he really loved doing this kind of comedy the best. And if you watch him, he moves fantastically. I mean, he is so well coordinated. I did a film called My Blue Heaven.
Oh, my.
And there's a dance in My Blue Heaven, and he just blows you away with what he does.
Right.
I
Well,
mean,
like the jail cell scene.
just
did you
one
ever
shot.
Did you ever consider cutting away?
I don't think we had any coverage. I mean, I think that was it.
Because even like when Glenn's talking to him at the table, you have one scene one shot where he's sipping from a straw, the kind of like, it's the only cutaway in that scene.
Right.
As well, you know.
Well, the jail scene was always shot from one angle.
Uh-huh.
And it's all on Steve because he's just, I mean, how can you go anywhere else? And he's just spectacular in that scene. And throughout the entire movie. You know, recently I had a couple of occasions to run into him. And, you know, I said, you know, I've done 3 of your movies. But that was about it.
Right. I mean, sometimes when you have a cutaway, it adds to the humor, but in that case,
Right.
you would
Yeah,
choose
yeah.
not to, right?
And if you watch, there are very few cutaways really in it. I mean, it's mostly on Steve. I mean, the whole rubric thing is just, it's just out of his mind. The whipping scene is just, I mean, when Michael Caine launches himself into the final, you know, sprint and leaps up into the air and whacks him on his face, Steve Martin's face is like not to be believed. And of course, you know, he had these like fiberglass fake legs with, I think they actually had hair on them. And so, you know, it was a real treat. And also, you have to remember, we were in Nice, south of France, which wasn't such a bad place to be. And Frank Oz would shoot the movie during the day, and at night he'd go into the theater and he'd record Miss Piggy voices, and then they'd send it back here. So he was like double dipping, as far as I could tell.
You know, we were talking about sound before. New York is known for that gritty sound from the 70s of the New York pictures, but kind of the real new kind of sound that's being used today was kind of discovered in San Francisco.
Well, I
and
think
you were
that,
lucky enough to be there.
yeah, I think that San Francisco reinvented the art of sound in the probably 80s, 70s, 80s, in which they had designated sound designers as opposed to supervising sound editors. So they would have sound designed by, and there was a little sort of like, I wouldn't say feud, but, you know, the old-fashioned sound editors sort of resented the newcomers. And they, you know, they developed lots of new techniques, but mostly they were instrumental in developing stereo.
And would you say maybe some of the New York editors who went to San Francisco for Apocalypse kind of brought that back with them? Maybe?
I would think so. Yeah, I think basically now sound is pretty much the same. It's changed a lot since, you know, in those days, these sound mixes was done with film, you know, sound reels on dubbers, and you'd have 50 of them. Now you have like a little disc. Put the disc in, and it's all available.
So all the editors that you worked with and around and directors, what did you learn?
Oh, you know, well, I learned the same thing from life, really. I think that when you, at least what I pick up is not what you learn but you learn not what to do, but what not to do. So I think that learning what not to do is much more important than learning what to do. So for instance, Dee Dee Allen would treat her directors like they were, I don't know, saints. She would cook for them and they would chat and you know, they would say, well, maybe, and then she'd have, oh, well, let me show you this, I did this, so she'd have like 20 choices, and the director would go, wouldn't know what to do. So I learned, give them maybe 2 choices. If they still want to, then you can do more, but let's not confuse the issue. And of course, editing changed. You know, it used to be that you were working on moviolas and flatbeds, and so the directors got bored. They didn't want to be around when you were doing that. Suddenly, when it turned to digital editing and you had a monitor in front and they could tell you, you know, push a button and you do this, oh, just try it. And so they would hang in all the time, which wasn't as much fun, really. But sometimes it was fun because if you really liked them. But as anything else, I mean, you know, editing, filmmaking today is at really at a terrible point. There's no work, there's no money, nobody knows what kind of movie to make. So I was lucky in the fact that I think that I started and sort of finished the heyday of film. My career just sort of like fit right in there. And now, I get calls that, I got a call from someone who was my agent who said, I don't know what to do. People are calling me, they can't get college tuitions, they can't get a mortgage, and these are very accomplished people, and yet they can't get work. And what's happening is that you want to be a director, you make a film, so you hire somebody, and then if it's not working out, you bring somebody in rather than start with them. So it saves a lot of money. And we're not even talking about studio interference, which used to be, I don't know how it is today, but was gigantic. I mean, you could be left hanging, you know, the studio will say, well, just, I remember working on, trying to think, Zoe.
Yeah.
What was the film with Norman, Renee, and Gary?
Prelude to a
I remember working on Prelude to a Kiss. And so there was a kiss between the 2 men, and the studio desperately wanted to get that kiss out. And they were just beside themselves. So the director and writer said to me, we want you to do it, and you preview it. We're not coming to the preview. And screw it up. I said, I can't screw it up. I mean, I just have to do it. I mean, it's easy to do, but I won't screw it up. All right, you go, we're not coming. Turned out that they left it in because it didn't make any difference. The preview and with it or without it was exactly the same, or at least the scores were pretty much the same. But previewing was like going, I mean, it was like the most uncomfortable. Two really hard parts about editing. The first time you had to show the film to the director, which your heart was in your stomach, and the second time was the first preview. And if the first preview didn't do well, then your life was over for the remainder of that film. And you know, I once was hired by somebody, and they said to me, you know, we previewed it in Los Angeles and did okay, got a 27. I'm thinking to myself, 27? I never heard of a 27. You know, if you get a 60, they send you back to the drawing board. And then he said, then we came to San Diego, we got a 6. I thought, a 6? How is a 6 possible? And that was Never Cry Wolf. And, you know, and it was a Disney film, and so it was unlike any other Disney film, so my daughter was so happy that I was doing a Disney film. And so when I was on The Right Stuff, they had a screening of it. She came and got ill at the same time the film was being shown. She was in the theater and came out of the theater. She was like 7 or 8, projectile vomiting. And they
It was
thought,
that bad, huh?
and so everybody's going, oh, this must be, I'm thinking to myself, oh my God, it must be terrible.
Maybe we have time for a few questions. Out there?
In the back.
I see way in the back, yes.
The music is so
Could you
big and
stand up, please?
Yeah. The music is so big and glorious. Can you talk about when you first started to hear the score with the picture?
Well, Miles Goodman died very young, actually. He was in his 50s. But they knew that they wanted to do a jazz violinist score, a la Stefan Grappelli, who I'd never heard of, but apparently is very well known. And so that's what they did. And the temp score was pretty much with it in, and Miles did some stuff. You know, it's nice when the composer can give you sketches that you can work with as you put the film together. But in this case, since the film was done on moviolas and flatbeds, it's not the same as in digital editing when you can add music yourself and all the elements as you're going along. So you can actually do a pretty safe facsimile of what the film is going to look and sound like. But in those days, you had to pre-mix and mix everything that you went to preview with.
But it looks like, I mean, the music is so
Exactly, yeah.
that you must have had a temp track and use
Yeah, we
another
did,
score.
because you can't really preview without a temp track and one that works well, or else they're going to jump all over you.
And did Miles use that temp track to?
I think, as I remember, Miles gave us a bunch of stuff, and we also used Stefan Grappelli. And
But he didn't like sort of work against the temp track to figure out his.
No. He. I mean, I don't really know the answer to that, except that I just took it for granted, and it worked so well. And so I think that going in, that was the concept. I think that Frank had that in his head, and you know, Chris Rock said to me there are two kinds of comedy directors. There are jockeys who just ride the comedian and, you know, do whatever he does, and there are really comic geniuses who know who knew what's funny. And Frank knew what's funny. I mean, you know, if you look at this stuff, some of it's perfect.
And he clearly was a student of like the Groucho Marx scene. in
Oh,
the hotel
yeah.
lobby. It's like
Well, and also, I mean,
paging that through.
how do you make expressions like the ones on Steve Martin's face? I mean, they're like, how does that happen? So, I mean, we're looking at true comic genius. And of course, apparently, he's a genius in a great many areas, which, you know, I mean, I wouldn't really appreciate. But,
He's a good banjo player.
but I mean, these scenes are like, and I mean, I don't know how many of you are familiar with his early work, but The Jerk is phenomenal. So, I mean, and I don't think you can find it anymore.
You can.
But in any
I mean,
case,
the Jerk yeah, back to sort of
Yeah.
really old style,
and I think that
one shot kind of things.
I think that he misses comedies like Dirty Rotten Scoundrels. I think he would prefer doing that as opposed to anything. Any other
Is
questions?
there anybody else out there, over there?
Yes. This film.
Wait, that's Philip Shopper. Wait a second.
Oh, Philip, come here a second.
Come down,
Okay,
Philip,
okay,
please.
yeah.
Come down,
This
come
film
down.
was based on an earlier film called Bedtime Story.
Yes, it was.
And in that movie, the David Niven
And Marlon
plays
Brando.
Michael Caine part, and instead of Steve Martin, you have America's most famous dramatic actor, Marlon Brando.
Exactly.
Now, it's hard to picture watching this film what Marlon Brando did in the movie, and I can't remember. But
I can't remember
did you guys
either.
at all look at that film? Or
We did.
was
We
there any
actually had a
discussion?
screening of that film before we started shooting. And as I remember, that film had nothing to do with this film. Aside from the fact that the writers got credit and, you know, I mean, it was nothing like this. I mean, Brando could never make the expressions that, I mean,
Pouting, right?
yeah, not in 1,000 years. What would he do?
So Philip Shopper and Steve worked together on Ishtar.
Right, and we've become friends, and I was here a couple of weeks, a month ago,
Yeah, for Mikey and Nikki. Right?
and Philip was one of the moderators, and was quite amusing.
All right, I think we have to
Okay.
call it quits.
Anyway, thank you very much.